What were you told about gold? Most likely, you heard that gold failed as a currency of exchange, which is why it was abolished. But the truth is, gold never failed. It was intentionally abolished. Say hello to the Bretton Woods system, the system that took over and didn't last too long. Come with us as we discuss the end of the Bretton Woods system, the beginning of the Dollar Ponzi, and the comparison between gold and money supply. We start with the birth of Bretton Woods system. During the early 90s, there was nothing like the Bretton Woods system. It was just the gold exchange standard that was in place. To understand better, what is the gold exchange standard? It is a monetary system under which a nation's currency may be converted into bills of exchange drawn on a country whose currency is convertible into gold at a stable rate of exchange. So any nation on the gold exchange standard is thus able to keep its currency at parity with gold without having to maintain as large a gold reserve as is required under the gold standard. Even the gold exchange standard was not widely used before the World War I. It was after the war that the standard came into prominence because of an inadequate supply of gold for reserve purposes. British sterling and the US dollar have been the most widely recognized reserve currencies. The requirement of a fixed rate of exchange for the reserve currency has the effect of limiting the freedom of the reserve currency country's monetary policy to solve domestic economic problems. But after World War II started, there was a great chaos that needed to be addressed. Troubles here and there. One of the troubles was the economic instability that followed the Great Depression and World War II. There was a need for an international system to foster economic stability and growth as currencies waged war against one another, leading to competitive devaluation and in turn shattering international trade. For that to be resolved, 44 nations convened in the town of Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, USA in 1944 to shape a new international monetary system. Hence the name, the Bretton Woods system. So what is this system about? The Bretton Woods system refers to an international monetary order whose aim was to encourage international economic cooperation, stability, and prosperity by promoting exchange rate stability and free trade. The hope was to create a system to facilitate international trade while protecting the autonomous policy goals of individual nations. It was meant to be a superior alternative to the interwar monetary order. If we're going to take a moment to go back for the cause of World War II, the interwar monetary order was arguably what led to both the Great Depression and World War II. But you see, during this discussion, not every nation had so much to say. It was largely dominated by the interests of the two great economic superpowers of the time, the United States and Britain. But here's another problem. Even these countries never wanted the same thing. They were far from united in their interests. Britain emerged from the war as a major debtor nation, while the US was poised to take on the role of the world's great creditor. Wanting to open the world market to its exports, the US position, represented by Harry Dexter White, prioritized the facilitation of freer trade through the stability of fixed exchange rates. Britain, represented by John Maynard Keynes, and wanted the freedom to pursue autonomous policy goals, pushed for greater exchange rates flexibility to ameliorate balance of payments issues. Finally, the rules of the new system were set. They eventually settled upon a compromise of fixed but adjustable rates. And this is how it works. Member nations would peg their currencies to the US dollar, and so to ensure the rest of the world that its currency was dependable, the US would peg the dollar to gold for $35 an ounce. Member nations would buy or sell dollars to keep within a 1% band of the fixed rate and could adjust this rate only in the case of a fundamental disequilibrium in the balance of payments. But how did they ensure the compliance of the nations with the new rules? A simple but not so simple answer. Establishment of two international institutions. One, the International Monetary Fund, known as IMF for short, and two, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is now what we know as the World Bank. The IMF is supposed to solve problems involving debt, while the World Bank lends money to institutions to, in theory, end poverty. The new set of rules, however, were officially outlined in the IMF Articles of Agreement. Further provisions of the articles stipulated that current account restrictions would be lifted while capital controls were allowed to avoid destabilizing capital flows. But what the articles failed to provide, however, were effective sanctions on chronic balance of payments surplus countries, a concise definition of fundamental disequilibrium, and a new international currency to augment the supply of gold gold as an extra source of liquidity. Another issue was that there was no definitive timeline for implementing the new rules, so it took time, about 15 years for the Bretton Woods system to be in full operation. But by this time, things have already begun to fall apart. The system was showing signs of instability. Let's discuss how the economy did in the early years of Bretton Woods. What the US wanted actually was for immediate implementation of Article's provisions, but the poor economic conditions in much of the post-war world made remedying balance of payments issues in a fixed exchange rate regime difficult without some current account exchange controls and external sources of funding. With no international currency created to provide supplemental liquidity, and given the limited loan capacities of the IMF and the IBRD, the now known World Bank, it soon became evident that the US would have to provide this external source of funding to the rest of the world while allowing for gradual implementation of current account convertibility. From 1946 to 1949, the US was running an average annual balance of payments surplus of $2 billion. In contrast, by 1947, European nations were suffering from chronic balance of payments deficits, resulting in the rapid depletion of their dollar and gold reserves. Rather than considering this situation advantageous, the US government realized it seriously threatened Europe's ability to be a continuing and vital market for American exports. Within this context, the US administered $13 billion of financing to Europe through the Marshall Plan in 1948, and some 2,000 countries following Britain's lead were permitted to devalue their currencies against the dollar in 1949. With this move, the shortage of dollars was alleviated and competitive balance was restored by reducing the US trade surplus. The European nations, trying to revive their economies shredded into pieces by the war, had much relief via the competitively aligned exchange rates, allowing them to experience rapid growth and restore their competitiveness vis-à-vis the US. Gradually, the exchange controls were lifted, with full current account convertibility finally achieved at the end of 1958. However, during this time, the US expansionary monetary policy that increased the supply of dollars, along with increased competitiveness from other member nations, soon reversed the balance of payments situation. The US was running balance of payments deficits in the 1950s and had a current account deficit in 1959. It all started with the depletion of US gold reserves accompanying deficits while remaining modest due to other nations' desire to hold some of their reserves in dollar-denominated assets rather than gold. The US surplus in its current account disappeared in 1959, and the Federal Reserve's foreign liabilities first exceeded its monetary gold reserves in 1960. These bred fears on the potential run on the nation's gold supply. With dollar claims on gold exceeding the actual supply of gold, there were concerns that the official gold parity rate of $35 an ounce now overvalued the dollar. The US feared that the situation could create an arbitrage opportunity whereby member nations could cash in their dollar assets for gold as the official parity rate and then sell gold on the London market at a higher rate, consequently depleting US gold reserves and threatening one of the hallmarks of the Bretton Woods system. Member nations indeed had individual incentives to take advantage of such an arbitrage opportunity, but there was also a collective interest in preserving this system. Their fear is the US devaluing the dollar because that would render their dollar assets less valuable. Well, the public needed an assurance, so the presidential candidate John Fitzgerald Kennedy was compelled to issue a statement late in 1960 that if elected, he would not attempt to devalue the dollar. So what if there was no devaluation? The US needed a concerted effort by other nations to revalue their own currencies. Despite appeals for a coordinated revaluation to restore balance to the system, member nations were reluctant to revalue, not wanting to lose their own competitive edge. Instead, they agreed that other measures were implemented, which included an expansion of the IMF's lending capacity in 1961 and the formation of the gold pool by European nations. Although the government tried to save the Bretton Woods system, they eventually witnessed the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. But before then, there was another attempt to rescue the system, which came with the introduction of an international currency, something similar to what Keynes had proposed in the 1940s. It will be issued by the IMF and will take the dollar's place as the international reserve currency. But serious discussions on this new currency, given the name of Special Drawing Rights, SDR, only started in 1964, and with the first issuance not occurring before 1970. The remedy proved to be too little or too late, or maybe the two. By the time of the first issuance of the SDRs, total US foreign liabilities were 4 times the amount of US monetary gold reserves. And despite a brief surplus in the merchandise trade balance in 1968-1969, the return to deficit thereafter was enough pressure to initiate a run on the US gold reserves. France had the intention to cash in its dollar assets for gold, and they didn't keep this intention a secret. Maybe not enough. Also, Britain requested to exchange 750 million for gold. So in the summer of 1971, President Richard Nixon closed the gold window temporarily.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
In a final attempt to keep the system alive, negotiations took place in the later half of 1971 that led to the Smithsonian Agreement, by which the United States agreed to devalue the dollar against gold by approximately 8.5% to $38 per ounce, and other countries offered to revalue their currencies relative to the dollar. But despite these revaluations, another run on the dollar occurred in 1973, creating inflationary flows of capital from the US to the Group of 10. Pegs were suspended, allowing currencies to float and bringing the Bretton Woods system of fixed but adjustable rates to a definitive end. You may think just one or two factors caused the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, but no. There are other factors that led to the collapse. We'll start from the most common, which is the decline in the economic power of the USA. You already know how it was no longer a dominant currency, how its value with gold could not be maintained, and how the fixed exchange rate collapsed. Another factor is the modification of the international financial system. Because of changes in the global financial system, developing nations were compelled to borrow from Western commercial banks. As a result, there were recurrent debt crises that intensified poverty in places like Africa and Latin America. Soon, the industrial world was also affected by unemployment, and as it increased, people traveled far distances in search of employment. Also, because of the cheap labor and low pay in Asian nations, multinational corporations moved their production units there. China became a desirable location for investment by foreign multinational corporations, and in turn, Chinese products flooded the global markets due to the local structure of the Chinese economy and its cheap wages. Now, let's talk about the gold versus money supply. JP Morgan once stated in 1912 that gold is money, everything else is credit. And after President Nixon ended the gold standard in 1971, all major currencies are fiat money, which means they are backed only by a government promise or government debt. For that, we can all agree that JP Morgan's words are truer today than when he said them. When it was the gold standard, money served 3 vital roles. 1, a medium of exchange. 2, a stable economic baseline. And 3, a store of value. But now, fiat currencies do not serve the latter 2 purposes. Modern governments print money out of thin air and take on exorbitant amounts of debt. Policymakers radically increase the supply of their fiat currencies regularly, destroying their intrinsic value. Therefore, the longer an investor holds onto his dollar bills, the poorer he gets. In case you didn't know, since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the US dollar has lost nearly 98% of its purchasing power. On the other hand, the gold price kept waxing strong as it multiplied 100-fold. This may seem a lot, but really gold has just maintained its purchasing power. Today, 1 ounce of gold purchases approximately the same goods and services it did 100 years ago. But is that the end? No. According to price data from Babylonian and Roman times, gold carries the same purchasing power it did thousands of years ago. During the reign of Emperor August, 27 BC to 14 AD, a Roman centurion earned the equivalent of 40 ounces of gold every year. The closest modern comparison to a Roman centurion might be a US Army captain who earns an annual salary equivalent to, yeah, you guessed right, 40 ounces of gold. To demonstrate this pattern perfectly today, we can use gold's relationship with the money supply. But before we go further, what is the money supply? Money supply refers to the total amount of currency in an economy. And because we have many definitions of money, economists calculate the money supply in several different ways. M2 is one of them and the most known. M2 tracks cash, checking deposits, saving deposits, and money market funds. These forms of money are all liquid, which means they can easily be converted to spendable currency. M2 money supply in the United States has grown exponentially since the Fed started tracking the metric in 1959. As we know, this has contributed to a constant increase in prices of goods and services. Exponential increases in the money supply inevitably cause severe devaluation in the nation's currency. The gold price tracks money supply growth. For that reason, the last 50 years have seen exponential returns in gold. Fortunately for gold investors, these parabolic money supply increases are far from over. When trying to understand the relationship between gold and the money supply, analysts typically focus on US economic data for two reasons. One, the dollar is the global reserve currency, and two, gold is priced in the US dollars on most global exchanges. This relationship extends to the global money supply as well. According to the World Gold Council, gold has reliably tracked global money supply growth for the last 50 years and even outpaced treasury bills. If we divide the price of gold by the M2 money supply, we get the gold M2 ratio. This ratio tells us how overpriced or underpriced gold is compared to M2's money supply. When the ratio is low, gold is undervalued. When the ratio is high, gold is overvalued. The most recent bull market on the chart, which started in 2016, is different from gold bull markets between 1971, 1980, and 2011, which correlates with large increases in the ratio. Gold has been rising in parallel with M2 money supply, so the ratio has traded sideways since 2016. This indicates that gold could have much further to climb during this bull market. Gold bull markets tend to vastly outperform money supply growth, which we have not yet seen. Even a reversion to the historical mean would constitute a huge increase in the price of gold. It is not sure if gold prices will follow the inflation rate in the short term. However, over the long run, gold always finds its way back to its historical baseline. Because of that, we can say gold serves the role of money better than every other financial assets. Don't you agree? The dollar, once tied to gold, is now just a confidence game. So, in addition to piling on debt that will never be repaid, the government also prints massive amounts of money. And don't you think it's just the dollar that's a Ponzi scheme? Other currencies are just the same, and they all lose value relative to gold, which has been the world's best store of value for many years now. What do you think about this? Let us know in the comment section.